I never thought my life could change so drastically, especially with someone I trusted and loved. My wife, Lisa, had always been my anchor, calm, composed, and dependable. We'd been together for 12 years, building a life that felt secure and steady. She was the kind of person who could light up a room with her quiet confidence, and I loved her for it. But over the past year, I'd noticed subtle changes. Lisa was spending more time out, claiming she had picked up new hobbies. I didn't question her too much. Everyone needs their space, right? She started yoga classes with my younger sister, Rachel, and they quickly became inseparable. I thought it was good for her, bonding with family, staying active, but looking back, I should have seen the signs. Rachel had always been the wild one, a stark contrast to Lisa's reserved nature. She was bold, adventurous, and unapologetically herself. At family gatherings, Rachel was the one making everyone laugh, while Lisa would sit by my side, occasionally joining in with a warm smile. It never crossed my mind that their friendship could cross boundaries. One Friday night, Lisa came home late, her cheeks flushed, and her energy electric. She told me they had been out for drinks after yoga. Just unwinding after a long week, she explained with a shrug. I believed her, why wouldn't I? Rachel had always been spontaneous, the kind to drag people out of their routines. But the truth had already begun to creep into my life, quiet and insidious. Over the next few months, Lisa and Rachel's bond seemed to deepen. At first, it felt harmless. Lisa often gushed about how Rachel had become a source of inspiration for her. She's so free-spirited, Lisa would say. It's like she knows exactly who she is. It was a sentiment I could understand. Rachel's confidence had always been magnetic. But soon, their friendship started to feel different. They spent more time together than ever before, not just at yoga but also at brunches, shopping trips, and even weekend hikes. Sometimes they'd come back to our house afterward, laughing uncontrollably about some inside joke. I'd sit there, smiling awkwardly, feeling like an outsider in my own home. One Saturday evening, Rachel invited us over for dinner at her apartment. She lived in a trendy loft downtown, the kind of place that screamed her personality, eclectic, colorful, and effortlessly chic. Lisa seemed more excited than usual, spending extra time in front of the mirror. She wore her favorite dress, the one that hugged her figure just right. I couldn't help but tease her. You're really trying to impress Rachel tonight, I joked, giving her a playful nudge. She froze for a moment, her hand brushing her hair back. Don't be silly, she said with a laugh, but her cheeks had flushed pink. The dinner was enjoyable enough, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the two of them shared glances that lingered a little too long. Rachel served wine and kept the conversation lively, steering it toward topics Lisa seemed passionate about: art, travel, and self-discovery. I listened, feeling like I was watching something unfold before me, something just out of reach. Later that night, after we'd returned home, I finally voiced my thoughts. You and Rachel seem really close these days, I said casually, not wanting to sound accusatory. Lisa shrugged, already pulling her hair into a loose ponytail. Isn't that a good thing? She's your sister. Don't you want us to get along? Of course I do, I replied, though her answer felt like a deflection. I just mean, it's almost like you spend more time with her than with me. Lisa sat on the edge of the bed, her expression softening. I didn't realize you felt that way, she said, reaching for my hand. Rachel she makes me feel alive, you know? Like I can be myself without any filters. It's refreshing. I nodded, trying to push down the pang of jealousy. I get it. Just don't forget about me, okay? Her smile returned, warm and reassuring. I could never forget about you. But in the weeks that followed, her words began to feel hollow. Lisa grew more secretive, often stepping out of the room to take phone calls or suddenly needing to run errands that stretched longer than expected. She even started spending the night at Rachel's apartment on occasion, claiming they had early yoga sessions and it was more convenient. You trust me, don't you? Lisa asked one evening as she packed an overnight bag. The question caught me off guard. Of course, I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? Always, I replied, forcing a smile. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered, should you? The cracks in our relationship were forming, but I was still blind to the truth. It wasn't until much later that I realized what had been right in front of me all along. The first crack appeared on an unassuming Tuesday night. I had come home early, hoping to surprise Lisa with dinner, something I hadn't done in a while. But when I walked into the house, I was greeted by an eerie silence. Lisa's car was in the driveway, so I knew she was home. Lisa? I called out, setting the grocery bags on the counter. No answer. I walked through the living room and toward the bedroom. The door was ajar, and I heard muffled laughter, hers, unmistakable and familiar. My heart lifted slightly. Maybe she was just on the phone. But as I approached, the tone shifted, growing softer and more intimate. I froze at the threshold. Lisa was sitting on the edge of our bed, her back to me. She wasn't on the phone. A laptop rested on her knees, the screen glowing brightly. From where I stood, I could make out Rachel's face on the video call, her features animated and glowing. I wish you were here, Lisa said, her voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. So do I, Rachel replied, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. Lisa reached up to touch the necklace she always wore, a delicate silver chain I'd given her on our 5th anniversary. It's been too long. I hate sneaking around like this. My stomach dropped. My mind raced to find a logical explanation, but no matter how I framed it, the words stung like a dagger. I know, Rachel murmured, her tone teasing. But that's what makes it exciting, isn't it? Lisa giggled, a sound I hadn't heard from her in months. My feet were rooted to the spot as 1,000 emotions surged through me, confusion, anger, betrayal. But one thought rang louder than the rest. This isn't real. It can't be. I stepped back, my movements clumsy, and the sound of my shoes scraping against the hardwood floor broke the spell. Lisa whipped around, her face straining of color as she met my gaze. Daniel, she stammered, slamming the laptop shut. I said nothing, my eyes darting between her flushed cheeks and the now closed laptop. My voice felt foreign when I finally spoke. What's going on? Lisa stood quickly, her hands fumbling as if she wasn't sure what to do with them. It's not what you think, she said, her voice trembling. What am I supposed to think, Lisa? I shot back, the hurt cutting through every word. It's just Rachel and me catching up, she said weakly, avoiding my eyes. We were joking around. Joking. Sneaking around felt exciting? That was a joke? I heard what you said, I replied, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. You hate sneaking around. What exactly are you sneaking around about? Lisa's lips parted as if to explain, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, each second twisting the knife deeper. I don't know how to explain, she finally said, her voice barely audible. Try, I demanded, taking a step closer. Start with why you're having this conversation with my sister. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw something that resembled guilt flicker across her face. It's complicated, she whispered. Complicated? I repeated, my voice sharp. You're my wife. She's my sister. Make it simple. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. Not this time. We didn't mean for it to happen, Lisa said, her voice cracking. It started as a friendship, and then it became something more. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My chest felt hollow, and my hands trembled as I struggled to process her words. Are you saying you're having an affair? With Rachel? Lisa's silence was all the confirmation I needed. The weight of Lisa's silence crushed me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room seemed to close in around us, suffocating with an air of betrayal that I couldn't escape. Say something! I finally shouted, the words erupting from me like a dam breaking. Lisa flinched, her tears spilling over. I never wanted to hurt you, Daniel, she whispered. You didn't want to hurt me? I repeated, incredulous. You've been sneaking around with my sister. Behind my back. How long, Lisa? How long has this been going on? She hesitated, and that hesitation was more painful than if she just blurted it out. A few months, she admitted. Since last fall. Months? I choked out, my voice shaking. I felt like I'd been hit by a freight train. You've been lying to me for months? I didn't mean for it to happen, she pleaded, stepping closer as if her proximity could soften the blow. It wasn't planned. Rachel and I, we connected in a way I didn't expect. My laugh was bitter and sharp. Connected? You mean you fell into bed together, Lisa? Don't sugarcoat this for me. Her face flushed deep red, and her lips trembled. It's not just physical, she said quietly. Those words felt like knives, sharper than anything she could have said. Oh, well, that makes it better, doesn't it? I snapped, the venom in my voice surprising even myself. Not only did you cheat, but you have feelings for her too. Perfect. I didn't want it to go this far, she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I couldn't stop it. I don't know what to do, Daniel. I'm so sorry. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I thought I knew. This wasn't my Lisa. This was someone I didn't recognize, someone who had ripped apart the very foundation of our life together. And Rachel, my sister. The betrayal doubled in my chest, an unbearable weight. She was family, someone I'd trusted implicitly, someone I'd protected my entire life. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room. Lisa called after me, her voice desperate, but I couldn't bear to hear her anymore. I ended up in the kitchen, gripping the counter to steady myself. My thoughts were a hurricane, violent and unrelenting. How could they do this? How could Lisa and Rachel betray me like this? I grabbed my phone, scrolling to Rachel's name. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I hesitated. What could I even say? What explanation could she possibly give that would make this okay? But I needed answers. I needed to hear it from her. I hit the button, and the phone rang twice before Rachel answered. Hey, big brother! She chirped, her tone light and cheerful. The sound of her voice, so casual, so normal, made my blood boil. Cut the crap, Rachel! I snapped. There was a pause. Daniel? She said, her tone shifting. Don't act like you don't know why I'm calling. I growled. I know about you and Lisa. Silence. The kind that screams louder than words. Rachel? I demanded. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Her apology felt like a slap in the face. Sorry? You're sorry? I shouted. You've been sleeping with my wife, Rachel. My wife. Do you have any idea what you've done? I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, echoing Lisa's words. Don't you dare give me that line, I hissed. You didn't mean for it to happen? Then why did you let it? Why didn't you stop it? Her voice broke as she tried to explain. I didn't know how to, it just felt right. Right? I shouted, the word exploding out of me. How can you even say that to me? This isn't right, Rachel. It's disgusting. I didn't want to hurt you, she interrupted, her voice trembling. Well, congratulations, I snapped. You've done a hell of a job. The betrayal from both sides had shattered me, but this was only the beginning. I hung up the phone, my chest heaving, and made a decision that would set the course for what came next. The next morning, I woke up with a headache pounding like a drumbeat in my skull. Sleep had been fleeting. Each time I closed my eyes, flashes of Lisa and Rachel together haunted me. By sunrise, my anger had simmered into a cold resolve. I needed answers, real ones, not the pathetic excuses they'd fed me. Lisa was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee clutched between her hands. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, and her hair a mess. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then the memory of her betrayal slammed back into me like a tidal wave. We need to talk, I said flatly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. She nodded silently, staring down at the steam rising from her cup. Did you ever stop to think about what this would do to me? I asked, my voice quiet but laced with venom. To us? She swallowed hard, finally meeting my eyes. Of course I did, she whispered. But I didn't know how to stop. I didn't want to stop. Her honesty felt like another blow, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. What do you even mean by that? Were you unhappy with me? Was this some kind of punishment? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't about you, Daniel. Don't you dare say it's about you and Rachel connecting again. I snapped. I've heard enough of that crap. What is this really about, Lisa? She hesitated, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the mug. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said softly. But when I'm with Rachel, I feel alive. Like I'm finally figuring out who I am. I stared at her, dumbfounded. So what? You just woke up one day and decided you're a lesbian? That's your excuse for tearing apart our marriage? Her face crumpled, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. I don't know what I am, she said, her voice breaking. I've been trying to figure it out, and Rachel, she made me feel things I've never felt before. I didn't mean for it to destroy us, Daniel. I'm so sorry. Her words hung in the air, a fog of confusion and hurt. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her own facade, the turmoil that had clearly been eating away at her. But it didn't soften the ache in my chest. What do you expect me to do with that? I asked, my voice trembling. You say you're sorry, but sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase what you and Rachel did behind my back. Do you love her? Lisa's lips parted, but no words came out. Her hesitation was all the answer I needed. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I can't do this right now, I said, my voice cold. I need space. She looked up at me, her tears flowing freely now. Please don't leave. We can work through this. Work through this? I repeated, incredulous. You cheated on me with my sister, Lisa? Do you have any idea how twisted that is? There's no working through this. I need to think. Before she could respond, I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. The drive to Rachel's apartment was a blur, my mind churning with anger and betrayal. When I arrived, I pounded on her door, my heart racing. It took a few moments before it swung open, revealing Rachel, who looked as disheveled and guilty as Lisa had. Daniel, she began, her voice cautious. I shoved past her into the apartment, spinning around to face her. You don't get to play innocent, I snapped. You owe me an explanation. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, echoing Lisa's words. Stop saying that, I shouted, my voice reverberating off the walls. You're my sister, Rachel. My family. And you went behind my back with my wife. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I know, she sobbed. I know I've ruined everything. But it wasn't planned, Daniel. I swear it wasn't. I laughed bitterly, pacing the room. So what? It just happened? You tripped and fell into an affair with Lisa? You betrayed me, Rachel. You've wrecked everything. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. I didn't want to hurt you, she whispered. But She broke off, shaking her head. But you what? I demanded. Say it, Rachel. I love her, she said finally, her voice breaking. The air left my lungs in a rush, and I stumbled back a step. You love her? Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I do. I love her. The final piece of my life shattered at her words. I stared at her, my mind blank, and then I turned and walked out the door. The betrayal had left me hollow, but I knew this was only the beginning. The fallout wasn't over yet, and the next steps would determine the rest of my life. I drove aimlessly for hours, the weight of everything crushing me. The roads blurred together, my mind racing with every what if and why. How could Lisa and Rachel betray me like this? How could they justify destroying everything we had? Eventually, I pulled into a deserted park. The early evening air was crisp, and the fading light cast long shadows over the empty benches. I sat in the car, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of the chaos. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen. Lisa. I couldn't bring myself to answer. Instead, I watched as the call ended, and a voicemail notification appeared. Moments later, a text followed, "Please come home. We need to talk." "I'm sorry." Sorry. That word had lost all meaning. I stared at the screen, the urge to respond wrestling with my exhaustion. Finally, I tossed the phone aside and stepped out of the car, needing the cool air to clear my head. I walked along the winding trail, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. By the time I returned home, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark except for the soft glow coming from the living room. I stepped inside, bracing myself for another confrontation. Lisa was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide and pleading. "Daniel," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't," I said, raising a hand. "I don't want to hear another apology right now." She nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the blanket. I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned against the kitchen island, staring at her. "You love her," I said flatly, my voice devoid of emotion. Lisa flinched. I don't know. I think I do. But I love you too, Daniel." Her words ignited a fire in my chest. "Do you even hear yourself?" I snapped. "You love me? This isn't love, Lisa. Love doesn't look like this. I'm trying to figure out who I am," she said desperately. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I can't lie to myself anymore." "Figure out who you are?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You figured it out by sleeping with my sister? That's your grand epiphany?" She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, I felt an urge to comfort her, but I shoved it down. She didn't deserve that, not now. "I don't know if I can forgive this," I said finally, my voice cracking. "You've shattered every bit of trust one had in you. And Rachel, she was supposed to be my family." "I know," Lisa whispered. "I know I've broken everything. But I don't want to lose you, Daniel. Please, we can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes." Her words should have given me hope, but instead, they felt hollow. "How?" I asked, my voice heavy. "How do you expect me to move past this? How do I look at you and not see this?" She didn't have an answer. The next morning, I called Rachel. She didn't answer, so I left a voicemail. My voice was calmer than I expected, but the rage still simmered beneath the surface. "I don't know what's going on in your head, Rachel," I said, my tone low. "But you've destroyed everything. I can't look at you the same way, and I don't know if I ever will. I need space from you. From both of you." After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where Lisa usually sat. The silence in the house was deafening, and for the first time, it felt like I was truly alone. Lisa gave me space in the following days, staying in the guest room and avoiding unnecessary conversations. I stayed busy with work, burying myself in projects to avoid thinking about her, or Rachel. But avoidance wasn't sustainable. The truth loomed over me, heavy and unrelenting. On the fourth night, I found myself sitting in the driveway, staring up at the house. I knew what I had to do, even if it felt like ripping my heart out. When I walked inside, Lisa was sitting in the living room, flipping through a book she clearly wasn't reading. She looked up as I entered, her expression wary. "I've made a decision," I said, my voice steady but cold. She stood, her hands twisting together. "Daniel, please. I'm filing for divorce," I interrupted. The words tasted bitter, but they needed to be said. Lisa's face crumpled, and she collapsed back onto the couch, sobbing. I stood there, watching her, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. "This isn't what I wanted," I said softly. "But you gave me no choice. She didn't respond, her sobs echoing through the room. As I walked away, heading to the bedroom to pack some essentials, I realized that this wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of the life I thought I knew, the one I'd built with Lisa and the trust I'd had in Rachel. But it was also the beginning of something new. I didn't know what that looked like yet, but for the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. The days following my decision to file for divorce passed in a haze. Lisa stayed out of my way, her presence in the house reduced to hushed movements and the occasional muted sob from the guest room. I avoided her, pouring my energy into work and trying to keep my mind occupied. But no amount of distraction could erase the storm brewing inside me. The real weight of the situation hit when my mother called. "Daniel," she began, her voice warm as always. "How are you, sweetheart? It's been a while since we talked." I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "I've been okay," I lied. "You don't sound okay," she said, her tone sharp with concern. "What's going on?" I opened my mouth to deflect, to brush it off, but the dam broke instead. "Lisa and I are divorcing," I blurted out. There was a stunned silence on the other end. "What?" she said finally, her voice tight. "Why? What happened?" My chest tightened. How could I even begin to explain this? "It's complicated," I said weakly. "Complicated?" she echoed, disbelief heavy in her voice. "Daniel, what's going on? You need to tell me." "It's Rachel," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "What about Rachel?" she asked, confusion giving way to suspicion. "She and Lisa." My voice broke, and I had to take a moment to steady myself. They'd been having an affair. The silence this time was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. "Are you saying?" She started, her voice shaking. "Are you saying Rachel is involved with Lisa?" "Yes," I said, my tone clipped. "That's exactly what I'm saying." She let out a choked gasp, and I could hear the rustling of movement on her end, like she was pacing. "Oh my God!" she whispered. "Daniel, I don't even know what to say. How could this happen? Rachel, your own sister?" "That's a question I've been asking myself every second of every day," I replied bitterly. Her voice rose, panic seeping in. "Does your father know? Does anyone else know?" "Not yet," I said. "But I'm sure it won't stay quiet for long." She exhaled sharply. "We need to talk as a family," she said firmly. "This can't stay in the dark, Daniel. We need to confront Rachel." The following weekend, I found myself back at my parents' house. The house I'd grown up in, filled with memories of laughter and family dinners, now felt oppressive and heavy with tension. Rachel was already there when I arrived, sitting stiffly on the couch with our parents. She looked up as I entered, her face a mix of guilt and defiance. "Daniel," my father said, his tone gruff. "Sit down." I dropped into a chair across from Rachel, avoiding her gaze. The room was silent for a moment, the air thick with unspoken accusations. "Rachel," my mother began, her voice trembling. "Daniel told us what's been happening. Is it true?" Rachel's jaw tightened, and she glanced at me briefly before nodding. "Yes," she said quietly. My mother let out a sharp cry, pressing a hand to her chest. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "To your own brother?" Rachel flinched but didn't respond. "This isn't just about Daniel," my father said, his voice cold. "This is about the entire family. Do you realize what you've done? You've torn us apart, Rachel." "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice defensive. "Stop saying that!" I snapped, the anger I'd been holding back finally spilling over. "You didn't mean for it to happen? That doesn't make it okay. You destroyed my marriage, Rachel. You betrayed me." Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't care. I wasn't interested in her guilt or her excuses. "Lisa and I connected," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan for it, but it felt right." "Right?" my mother repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. How can you say that? It's wrong, Rachel. It's disgusting. Rachel's tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I never wanted this to happen. But it did, I said coldly. And now we all have to live with the consequences. The fallout from that family meeting was swift and brutal. My parents were devastated, their faith in Rachel shattered. My mother couldn't even look at her without breaking down, and my father's disappointment was palpable. Rachel tried to reach out to me in the days that followed, but I ignored her calls and texts. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I didn't know if I ever would be. Lisa stayed in the house for now, though we barely spoke. The tension was unbearable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before one of us left for good. The betrayal had fractured not just my marriage but my family as well. The pieces lay scattered, and I wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. The days blurred together as I struggled to balance the wreckage of my personal life with the demands of my job. Each evening felt like a minefield, with Lisa still living in the house but confined to the guest room. We avoided each other like ghosts haunting the same space, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The silence between us was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the chaos brewing outside. My parents, still reeling from the revelation, oscillated between anger and heartbreak. My mother called me daily, her voice heavy with disbelief. My father, ever the stoic, kept his words few but sharp. Don't let her take you for a fool, Daniel, he warned one evening. You've got to protect yourself. And if Rachel wants to play the victim, that's her burden to carry. Not yours. The advice hit home. I couldn't sit idly by and let this spiral further. It was time to take action. The following week, I met with an attorney, David Cross. His office was modest but professional, with shelves of legal books lining the walls and a small stack of client files on his desk. He listened intently as I laid out the situation, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail. You've got quite a mess here, Daniel, he said finally, leaning back in his chair. But the good news is, you're in a no-fault divorce state. That means Lisa's infidelity won't directly impact the division of assets or alimony. Still, her actions could influence negotiations if we play our cards right. I nodded, though the thought of Lisa walking away with anything more than a suitcase made my stomach churn. What about the house? I asked. That depends on a few factors, David said. If you want to keep it, we'll need to determine if you can buy out her share or if it's more practical to sell and split the proceeds. Do you have any shared debts or significant assets beyond the house? We've got a joint savings account, some retirement funds, and a car loan, I replied. David jotted down notes. We'll sort through it all. My advice? Gather as much documentation as you can, bank statements, pay stubs, anything that outlines your financial situation. The clearer the picture, the stronger our position. As I left his office, I felt a flicker of control for the first time in weeks. The legal battle ahead would be draining, but at least I was taking a step toward reclaiming my life. Back at home, Lisa sensed the shift. She cornered me in the kitchen one evening, her expression wary. You've been meeting with a lawyer, she said, her voice low. I nodded, unwilling to lie. Yes. I told you, I'm filing for divorce. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Do we have to do this, Daniel? Can't we try to work things out? Work things out? I repeated, incredulous. Lisa, you betrayed me with my sister. What exactly is there to work out? I know I've destroyed your trust, she said, her voice trembling. But I still love you. And I. Stop. I cut her off, my tone icy. Don't say you love me. Not when your actions have proven otherwise. She flinched, her composure cracking. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. Well, you should have thought of that before you chose her, I said coldly. She retreated, her shoulders slumping as she disappeared back into the guest room. A few days later, Rachel showed up unannounced at my office. She looked worse than I'd ever seen her, hair disheveled, eyes rimmed with dark circles, and her usual confident demeanor replaced by hesitation. Daniel, please, she said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Can we talk? I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed to send her away, to slam the door in her face. But curiosity, or perhaps the last threads of brotherly duty, compelled me to hear her out. 5 minutes, I said curtly, motioning for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the chair, wringing her hands. I know I've ruined everything, she began, her voice shaking. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to make up for. But I need you to understand. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. That seems to be everyone's favorite excuse, I said dryly. She winced but pressed on. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve your forgiveness. But you're my brother, Daniel. I can't stand the thought of losing you completely. Her words might have carried more weight if they hadn't felt so self-serving. You made your choices, Rachel, I said, my tone hard. And now you have to live with the consequences. Just like Lisa does. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I stood, signaling the end of the conversation. So am I. The fallout of Lisa and Rachel's betrayal wasn't just a storm, it was a hurricane, leaving destruction in its wake. My relationship with Rachel was shattered, my marriage on the brink of finality, and my parents were caught in the crossfire, struggling to reconcile their love for their children with their anger and disappointment. But amidst the wreckage, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. This was my chance to rebuild, to carve out a new life from the ruins. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But it would be mine. The morning of my first meeting with Lisa and our attorneys arrived far too quickly. I spent the night tossing and turning, my mind racing through every possible scenario. By the time I arrived at David Cross's office, I was running on caffeine and sheer determination. Lisa was already there, sitting in the lobby with her attorney, a polished woman named Ellen Drake. Lisa looked small, her shoulders hunched, and her eyes downcast. For a moment I almost felt pity for her. Almost. We were ushered into a conference room, the atmosphere tense. David greeted Ellen with the kind of measured civility lawyers seem to excel at, then turned his attention to me. Let's start with the financials, David said, spreading out a series of documents. We've outlined a division of assets that we believe is fair. Ellen leaned forward, scanning the papers. Fair is subjective, she said smoothly. Lisa has certain needs that must be considered, particularly as she's the one leaving the marital home. My stomach twisted. I knew this was coming, but hearing it said so plainly stung. Lisa chose this path, David said firmly. My client shouldn't be penalized for her decisions. Ellen's expression didn't waver. Regardless, Lisa is entitled to her share of the assets. She's agreed to forego alimony, which I think we can all agree is a generous concession. Generous? I snapped before I could stop myself. She's the one who cheated. She's the one who destroyed our marriage. Lisa flinched, her face pale. Ellen placed a calming hand on her arm. We're not here to debate fault, she said, her tone clipped. The law is clear on what Lisa is entitled to. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay quiet as David continued to negotiate. The back and forth felt endless, each detail dissected and scrutinized. The house would be sold, the proceeds split evenly. Our joint savings would be divided, though I'd retain my retirement account. It was all so clinical, so devoid of the emotions that had led us here. As the meeting wrapped up, Lisa hesitated, then leaned forward. There's one more thing, she said softly, her voice trembling. David raised an eyebrow, glancing at me for direction. I nodded, curious despite myself. Lisa took a deep breath. I know I've hurt you, Daniel. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to offer something, to try and make things right, even a little. What are you talking about? I asked, my tone wary. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. It's a letter, she said. For Rachel. I don't know if it'll mean anything to you, but I wanted you to know that I'm ending things with her. The room fell silent. I stared at the envelope, a mix of disbelief and confusion swirling in my chest. You're ending it? Lisa nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't fix what I've broken with you. But I can stop making it worse. I want to move forward, Daniel. And I think this is the first step. Her words felt genuine, but I couldn't bring myself to trust them completely. Why now? I asked. Because I've realized that what Rachel and I had, it wasn't right, she said, her voice cracking. It wasn't fair to you, to her, or to me. I need to figure out who I am, but I can't do that while I'm still tangled up in this mess. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, untouched. I wasn't sure what to do with it, whether to give it to Rachel, to throw it away, or to read it myself. In the end, curiosity won. Late one night, I opened the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. The letter was short but heartfelt. Lisa apologized to Rachel, acknowledging the damage they had caused and admitting that their relationship was a mistake. She wrote about needing to find herself and how continuing their affair would only deepen the pain for everyone involved. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I didn't call Rachel or tell her about the letter. She'd made her choices, just like Lisa had. And while Lisa's gesture didn't erase what she'd done, it felt like a step toward closure. The weeks that followed were grueling. The divorce paperwork was filed, the house was listed for sale, and Lisa moved into a small apartment across town. We communicated sparingly, only about the logistics of the divorce. Rachel, meanwhile, stayed quiet. My parents had distanced themselves from her, their disappointment palpable. The family dynamic was irreparably fractured, and I wasn't sure it would ever heal. But amid the chaos, I began to see a sliver of hope. The weight of Lisa's betrayal was still heavy, but it no longer felt suffocating. I started to reclaim pieces of myself, rekindling friendships, picking up hobbies I'd neglected, and envisioning a future that didn't revolve around the life I'd lost. The day the divorce finalized felt surreal. I sat across from Lisa in the courthouse, the weight of a decade of marriage condensed into a few signatures on a stack of papers. She looked tired, her face drawn, but there was a strange calmness in her demeanor. "Good luck, Daniel," she said quietly as we stood to leave. I nodded, unsure what to say. "You too." And with that, we parted ways, the chapter of our marriage officially closed. Adjusting to life on my own wasn't easy. The house sold faster than I'd expected, and I moved into a modest apartment closer to work. It was a far cry from the life Lisa and I had built together, but in a way, it felt like a clean slate. I threw myself into my job, picking up extra projects to keep my mind busy. Evenings were quieter than I was used to, but I slowly began to appreciate the solitude. I started jogging again, something I hadn't done in years, and rediscovered the joy of losing myself in a good book. My friends rallied around me, pulling me out of my shell on weekends. At first, it felt forced, nights out at bars or casual dinners, but eventually, I found myself laughing again, the weight of the past beginning to lift. About 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Rachel showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there, clutching a bottle of wine and looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. "Daniel," she said hesitantly, "can we talk?" I considered slamming the door in her face, but something in her expression stopped me. I stepped aside, letting her in. She placed the bottle on the counter, fidgeting with her hands. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," she began. "You're not wrong," I replied, crossing my arms. She nodded, her eyes downcast. "I deserve that. I deserve worse, honestly. But I needed to say this in person." "Say what?" I asked, my voice flat. She took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Daniel. Truly, deeply sorry. I know I've ruined everything, our relationship, our family, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to fix myself. I've started therapy, and I've been reflecting on what I did, what I destroyed." Her words sounded sincere, but the wounds she'd inflicted were still raw. "Rachel, I appreciate you saying that," I said after a long pause. "But it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't fix anything." "I know," she said quickly. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness, not yet. I just wanted you to know that I'm taking responsibility for my actions. That I'm trying to be better. I studied her, searching for any hint of manipulation. But all I saw was a broken woman, grappling with the consequences of her choices. I hope you mean that, I said finally. For your sake. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered before turning to leave. Several weeks later, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop on a rainy Saturday morning, flipping through a book while nursing a black coffee. The place was quiet, the soft hum of conversation blending with the patter of rain against the windows. Excuse me, a voice said, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked up to see a woman standing by my table, a tentative smile on her face. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with warm brown eyes and a scarf draped over her shoulders. Is this seat taken? She asked, gesturing to the chair across from me. No, go ahead, I said, closing my book. She sat down, pulling out a laptop and setting it on the table. Thanks, she said, glancing at the book in my hands. That's a great read. Her name was Emily, and she was working on a freelance design project for a local nonprofit. We struck up a conversation, her easy laughter and sharp wit catching me off guard. By the time I left the cafe, I felt lighter than I had in months. Emily and I started seeing each other casually, coffee dates, walks in the park, dinners that stretched into long conversations. She knew I was recently divorced, and she approached our budding relationship with patience and understanding. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, and I was okay with that. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe, like I was moving forward instead of being stuck in the shadow of my past. Lisa and Rachel were still present in my thoughts, but their hold on me was loosening. The pain of their betrayal was becoming a scar, something that would always be there but wouldn't define me. One evening, as Emily and I sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline, she turned to me, her expression serious. You've been through a lot, Daniel, she said softly. But I hope you know that you deserve to be happy again. Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. For the first time, I began to believe them. The days with Emily were refreshing, a breath of air I hadn't realized I'd been suffocating without. Yet, as much as she brought a sense of peace into my life, the shadows of my past still lingered. Healing was never linear, and reminders of Lisa and Rachel had a way of creeping in when I least expected them. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when my mother called, her voice shaky with suppressed emotion. Daniel, I need you to come over. Your father and I have been talking, and we need to address this thing with Rachel as a family. I sighed, rubbing my temples. What's left to address, Mom? It's over. It's not over, she insisted. We're still a family. Broken, yes, but we need to figure out where we go from here. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet them the following Sunday. When I arrived, I was surprised to see Rachel already there, seated stiffly in the living room with a cup of untouched tea in her hands. My father stood by the window, his face impassive, while my mother flitted around nervously, adjusting cushions that didn't need fixing. Thanks for coming, my mother said, her voice tight. I sat on the opposite end of the room, keeping a cold distance from Rachel. So, what's this about? I asked bluntly. My father turned, his expression hard. It's about this family not falling apart any further. Rachel's been trying to make amends, and we need to decide if we're going to let her. My chest tightened, anger bubbling just below the surface. Make amends? I said, my voice sharp. She destroyed my marriage, Dad. What kind of amends could possibly fix that? Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. I'm not saying what she did was excusable, my father continued. But holding on to this resentment isn't doing any of us any good. We can't change what happened, but we can decide what happens next. I looked at Rachel, who was staring into her tea like it held the answers to the universe. And what do you think happens next? I asked her bitterly. She glanced up, her voice barely above a whisper. I think we try to move forward. Somehow. Move forward? I repeated, incredulous. You think I can just forgive and forget, Rachel? Pretend this never happened? I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice trembling. But I'm asking for a chance to rebuild some kind of relationship with you. You're my brother Daniel, and I can't stand what I've done to us. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. The conversation that followed was long and painful, filled with tears, accusations, and moments of silence so thick they felt suffocating. My parents acted as mediators, urging both of us to find common ground. In the end, I agreed to try, though I made it clear it wouldn't be easy. Rachel's betrayal had left scars, and while I could entertain the idea of a future where we weren't estranged, it would take time. I'll try, I said finally, my voice heavy. But don't expect miracles. Rachel nodded, her relief evident. That's all I'm asking for. As I navigated this new chapter with Rachel, I found myself leaning heavily on Emily for support. She listened patiently, offering advice when I asked for it, and simply being there when I didn't. But I couldn't ignore the strain it was putting on our budding relationship. One evening, as we sat on my couch, Emily turned to me, her expression serious. Daniel, I care about you. A lot, she said, her voice steady. But I need to know, are you ready for this? For us? Because it feels like you're still caught in the past. Her words stung because they were true. As much as I wanted to move forward, part of me was still tangled in the mess Lisa and Rachel had left behind. I'm trying, I said honestly. But I won't lie to you, it's a process. Emily nodded, her gaze searching mine. I can be patient, Daniel. But I need to know that you're in this with me. I am, I said, reaching for her hand. I just need time. Rachel followed through on her promise to seek therapy, and over time, I began to see changes in her. She was more reflective, less defensive, and genuinely remorseful for the pain she'd caused. We started meeting occasionally for coffee or walks in the park, neutral ground where we could talk without the weight of our history pressing down on us. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments where the bitterness threatened to resurface, but I found myself softening toward her. One afternoon, as we walked along the waterfront, she turned to me, her expression earnest. I know I'll never undo what I've done, she said. But I hope someday you'll see that I'm not that person anymore. I didn't respond immediately, letting her words sink in. Time will tell, I said finally. Even as I began to rebuild bridges with Rachel, the internal battle raged on. Forgiving her was one thing, forgiving Lisa was another. She had been my partner, my confidant, and the one person I thought I could always rely on. Her betrayal had cut deeper than anything else, and moving past it felt impossible. But I knew that holding on to the anger would only keep me trapped. If I truly wanted to heal, I needed to let it go, not for Lisa's sake, but for mine. A month after my tenuous truce with Rachel began, Lisa reached out unexpectedly. It was a simple text message, her first since the divorce was finalized. Daniel, I know I don't have the right to ask, but would you be willing to meet me? There are things I need to say. Closure, maybe. My first instinct was to ignore her. What could she possibly say that I hadn't already heard? But as the day wore on, her words gnawed at me. Closure wasn't just for her, it might be something I needed too. We met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far enough from familiar faces to avoid awkward encounters. Lisa was already seated when I arrived, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of tea. She looked nervous, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a fragile vulnerability. Thanks for coming, she said as I sat down across from her. I nodded, saying nothing. The silence between us was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. I don't even know where to start, she admitted, her voice trembling. Try the beginning, I said coldly. She flinched but nodded. I've had a lot of time to think since, everything, she began. And I realized now that I wasn't just running from our marriage. I was running from myself. Her words caught me off guard, and I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Go on. I didn't handle it right, she continued, her eyes brimming with tears. I should have talked to you, told you how I was feeling. But instead, I turned to Rachel, and I let everything spiral out of control. You didn't just turn to Rachel, Lisa, I said, my voice sharp. You betrayed me. You betrayed everything we built together. I know, she said, her tears spilling over. And I hate myself for it, Daniel. I hate what I did to you, to us, to Rachel. I destroyed everything, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I see it now. I see the damage I caused, and I'm so sorry. Her apology, raw and unfiltered, left me stunned. I'd imagined this moment 100 times, picturing anger, excuses, or defensiveness. But instead, there was only remorse. For the first time since everything had unraveled, we talked, not as exes, but as two people trying to make sense of the wreckage. I loved you, Lisa, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I still don't understand why I wasn't enough. Her face crumpled, and she reached across the table, stopping just short of touching my hand. You were enough, Daniel. You always were. This wasn't about you, it was about me. I was lost, and I took the easy way out instead of facing my fears. Fears of what? I asked, struggling to keep my composure. Of who I am, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been questioning my identity for years, but I buried it because I was afraid of what it would mean for us. For me. And when Rachel came into the picture, it was like she held up a mirror I couldn't ignore anymore. Her words were a gut punch, and I struggled to process them. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her that her self-discovery had come at the expense of my heart. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted from carrying so much anger, felt a flicker of understanding. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally, my voice breaking. But I think I can try. Not for you, for me. Her tears flowed freely now, and she nodded. That's more than I deserve. Thank you, Daniel. The conversation ended there, and as I walked away, I felt lighter. The pain was still there, but it felt less suffocating, as if I'd finally let go of a piece of the weight I'd been carrying. That evening, I found myself sitting in my apartment, reflecting on everything Lisa had said. For the first time, I began to see her not just as the woman who had betrayed me, but as someone who was deeply flawed and struggling. It didn't excuse her actions, but it made them human. As I stared out the window, watching the city lights twinkle, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving Lisa of her guilt. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment. When I shared the encounter with Emily later that week, she listened intently, her hand resting gently on mine. I think it's brave of you, she said when I finished. To face her like that, to even entertain the idea of forgiveness. Not everyone could do that. I don't feel brave, I admitted. I feel tired. But maybe that's a sign I'm ready to move forward. She smiled, her warmth grounding me. You've come a long way, Daniel. And you'll keep going. I'm here for you, every step of the way. Her words were a balm to my soul, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope, not just for healing, but for happiness. Months passed, and the chaos that had once consumed my life began to settle into a quiet rhythm. The divorce was finalized, my relationship with Rachel was slowly mending, and Lisa had become a distant, bittersweet memory. The wounds they had left behind were still there, but they had scabbed over, no longer bleeding every time I thought of them. Rachel and I met for lunch one day, something I'd never thought possible in the aftermath of her betrayal. She seemed lighter, more grounded, as if her time in therapy had begun to reshape her into a version of herself I could trust again. I know I'll never earn back all of your trust, she said as we sipped our coffee. But I'm grateful you've even let me try. I nodded, stirring sugar into my mug. It's not easy, I admitted. But you're my sister, Rachel. And as much as I wanted to shut you out forever, I couldn't. Family doesn't work like that. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, I reached out and gave her hand a squeeze. Lisa reached out once more, this time in the form of a handwritten letter. I hesitated for days before opening it, unsure if I was ready to hear her voice again, even on paper. The letter was surprisingly brief, but it carried a weight that stayed with me long after I read it. Daniel, I know words will never be enough to heal what I've broken, but I wanted to thank you for meeting with me and giving me the chance to apologize. You were a good husband, and I'll always cherish the years we spent together. I hope you find the happiness you deserve. It wasn't closure, not really, but it was the closest thing I would ever get. And I decided that was enough. Emily and I grew closer with each passing day. She became my anchor, a steady presence that reminded me life didn't have to be as chaotic and painful as it had been. One evening, as we sat together on her couch, a glass of wine in her hand and a book in mine, she turned to me with a soft smile. Do you think you're ready to let it all go? She asked, her voice gentle. I considered her question, letting the words settle over me like a warm blanket. I think I am, I said finally. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward. Months turned into a year, and the pieces of my life began to fall into place. I wasn't the same person I had been before Lisa and Rachel's betrayal. I was stronger, more cautious, but also more open to the possibilities that lay ahead. Emily and I took things slowly, savoring the process of building something meaningful. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but it didn't need to be. It was steady, comforting, and filled with a quiet kind of joy. Rachel became a part of my life again, though the relationship we rebuilt was different. It was cautious, tentative, but grounded in a shared determination to move past the mistakes that had nearly destroyed us. Lisa, on the other hand, faded into the background. I heard through mutual friends that she was doing well, finding her footing and exploring her identity. I didn't wish her ill. In fact, I hoped she found the peace she was searching for. One sunny afternoon, Emily and I stood at a park overlooking the city skyline. She slipped her hand into mine, her touch grounding me in the present. Do you ever think about what might have been? She asked, her gaze thoughtful. Sometimes, I admitted. But not in a way that hurts anymore. What happened shaped me, but it doesn't define me. I think I'm finally at peace with it. She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. I'm glad, she said softly. As we stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized she was right. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, they were all part of my story, but they weren't the ending. This was. And it was beautiful.